on the planned revision to New Reg 0654 FEMA Rep 1. My name is Bill Mayer. I'll be the facilitator for this afternoon's meeting. And I'd like to emphasize on this slide the word discussion. It's meant to be a dialogue with the affected organizations and the public on items to consider for the proposed revision of the New Reg 0654 FEMA Rep 1 Guidance Document Manual. We'll go to the room next, and I'll invite Ms. Dominique French to come up and make a comment.
Hello, my name is Dominique French, and I'm a campaigner with Nuclear Information and Resource Service. First of all, I'd like to thank the NRC and FEMA for hosting these meetings in Kansas City and Washington, D.C. to discuss what improvements must be made to emergency planning regulations. Now, I watched the Kansas City telecast, and I'm aware that this is preliminary scoping, but we at NEARS feel that this is an important issue, especially emergency planning zones, that should be addressed now. In correlation with Michael Marriott's presentation, I will be going in further detail regarding our petition for rulemaking to the NRC. A brief overview of our petition, though most of you are probably familiar with it, is it was filed in February 2012, and the petition for rulemaking specifically called for the creation of a 3-tiered emergency planning zone and the introduction of full-scale drills and exercises on a biennial basis. Additionally, those exercises and drills should alternately deal with an initiating or concurrently regionally appropriate event, such as a hurricane in Florida or an earthquake in California. The 3-tiered approach would include a 25-mile plume emergency planning zone. In this zone, detailed plans would be developed and full-scale drills will be conducted. Sirens to alert local populations about the emergency will be installed, and transportation for elderly, prison, and school-age populations will be arranged. This is obviously an expansion on the current 10-mile EPZ. Additionally, there will be a 50-mile emergency response zone, and this will require the identification of evacuation routes and move the emergency centers, which would be currently outside of the 25-mile zones. And finally, the 100-mile ingestion pathway emergency planning zone. In the event of a radionuclide release, surface and groundwater, as well as crops and vegetation, may be affected. Measures should be adopted to protect them within 100 miles of this emergency. Now, these upgrades, which I'm sure you knew about before this meeting, are crucial because the regulations have been largely static for the last 30 years with little change. Given the aftermath of Chernobyl, Fukushima, and 9/11, this is unacceptable. Now let's first start with why this happened. Well, Chernobyl, first and foremost, evacuation efforts in Chernobyl were widespread and long-lasting. There is an 18-mile radius surrounding the reactor, which has been labeled a dead zone, which is expected to remain uninhabitable for several hundred years. While evacuations initially were limited to several zones within an 18-mile radius of the reactor, in fact, the 30-kilometer exclusion zone was amended and expanded to cover 4,300 square kilometers, stretching as far as 300 miles north. Between the years of 1986 and 2000, approximately 350,400 people were evacuated from severally contaminated areas of Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. Additionally, areas up to 500 kilometers away from Belarus remain uninhabitable. It is clear that had adequate emergency plans and radiation monitoring been in place in the Soviet Union during 1986, many, probably most, of the towns and areas would have been evacuated to protect against exposure from these radioactive hotspots. These hotspots, which were created right after the accident, but people were not evacuated for months or years, would later demonstrate a huge failure of emergency planning. Coinciding with the Chernobyl issue of evacuation, food contamination. Food contamination continues to plague the Chernobyl region. Radionuclides including iodine-131, cesium-134, and cesium-137 tainted crops and animal products in Belarus. After the Fukushima disaster, samples of berries, milk, and potatoes in areas grown outside of the Chernobyl exclusion zone were taken. Those samples continued to exhibit contamination. Next, Fukushima. Evacuation efforts first began in the 3-kilometer zone around March 11, 2011, which was quickly expanded to a 10-kilometer radius around Fukushima Daiichi, and then 20 kilometers, or roughly 12 miles, by March 12th. 140,000 people were evacuated from the area. On March 15th, 2011, as Mary Lampert told you, Chairman Yasko urged Americans within 50 miles of Fukushima to evacuate. This recommendation was followed by a similar statement from the U.S. State Department. Around March 25, 2011, the Japanese government established a new zone covering an area of 20 to 30 kilometers from the Daiichi site and encouraged but did not require evacuation from that zone. About 3 weeks later, the government issued mandatory evacuations from some communities 25 miles away from Fukushima. There were heavy radiation levels that were measured and exceeded the evacuation criteria. Japan's government was strongly criticized, both in Japan itself and internationally, for delaying the evacuation of these communities. The Japanese Diet came out with a report in June 2012 that outlined the deficiencies in the Japanese regulatory structure that led to this large-scale disaster. Some of these criticisms include the central government was not only slow in informing the municipal governments about the nuclear power plant accident, but failed to convey the severity of the accident. Similarly, the speed of information in the evacuation areas varied significantly depending on the distance from the plant. There was also great confusion over the evacuation caused by prolonged shelter-in-place orders and voluntary evacuation orders. Some people were evacuated to areas with high levels of radiation because information about radiation monitoring was unavailable. These people should have been evacuated much earlier. A tested evacuation plan and appropriate radiation monitoring likely would have substantially reduced this population's exposure to radiation. For these kinds of reasons, in October 2011, Japan announced its plans to expand its own emergency planning zones. Going along with the food issues in Japan, there have been widespread reports of discoveries and interdiction of tainted food in crops and livestock and soil in Japan. A major area of concern is rice contamination. Shortly after the disaster, iodine-131 was found in milk and spinach in towns within the Fukushima prefecture, some 18 kilometers away from Fukushima Daiichi. Some farms 100 kilometers away and further have been contaminated by radiation from Fukushima. Clearly, food interdiction is a huge problem, and it can extend very, very far. Earlier, I talked about natural disasters and emergency response planning and the need to have alternating exercises and drills with initiating or concurrent regionally appropriate events. This is crucial because of the increases in natural disasters, which have become increasingly prevalent. In 2011, it was termed the most damaging weather year ever for the United States. First, in March 2011, there was the 9.0 earthquake and 40-plus foot tsunami that struck Japan, causing Fukushima Daiichi's failure. Then, in August 2011, we saw an earthquake strike the center of Virginia, resulting in ground motion acceleration about twice the design basis of North Anna nuclear power plant. Also in August, Hurricane Irene struck and created unprecedented flooding in the northern state of Vermont. This clearly demonstrates that weather and natural phenomena can greatly affect nuclear power plants. At Fukushima, the earthquake and tsunami initiated the nuclear accident. Hurricanes Katrina and Irene have greatly compromised evacuation had a nuclear emergency occurred concurrently. So could a tornado, or a wildfire, or a flood, or an earthquake. Concurrent NRC emergency planning regulations do not reflect that natural disasters can cause nuclear accidents and or may occur concurrently with the nuclear accidents. In either event, natural disasters can greatly complicate the ability to evacuate a given area. It is based on these reasons that we request that emergency planning zone expansion should be considered in coordination with this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. French.